Okay.
Okay, so good morning and welcome to the West Coast Time Fellowship. This morning I wanted to share from Exodus. And so take your Bibles and turn to Exodus chapter 5. And what I want to talk about, again, I'm kind of sharing things that I'm getting out of the Experiencing God class. And this was one this past week that just really blessed me a lot, and I thought was just useful kind of at any time in our lives. And it's the idea that uh, unless God gives us his perspective, or we just simply recognize that we don't have God's perspective and are okay with that, generally speaking, what happens to us is we have our own perspective on things, and we do not have God's perspective. And when you're in the middle of what God is doing, frequently our own perspectives can, what's the right term? Can give us a false idea about what's going on. And we come up with, it looks very negative to us, right? So I want to talk about a couple of records today. We're going to look at this in Exodus, and then we might go to Genesis. We'll talk about Joseph. But this is Moses. God has sent Moses back to Egypt, sent him to Pharaoh to get Pharaoh to, basically God is hearing the prayers of the people who are oppressed, and he's sending Moses there to, what God's plan is to free them and bring them into the promised land. But notice that's not really it's not really initially what's going on. God doesn't send Moses to Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go." That happens later, right? Initially, all he's doing is he's trying to get Pharaoh to give permission for the Israelites to go out into the desert for 3 days to worship Yahweh, right? So in verse 1 of chapter 5, it says, "Later Moses and Aaron went in and said to Pharaoh, 'This is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so that they may hold a festival for me in the wilderness.' But Pharaoh responded, 'Who is Yahweh that I should obey him by letting Israel go? I do not know anything about Yahweh, and besides, I will not let Israel go.' Then they answered, 'The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go on a 3-day trip into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to Yahweh our God, or else he may strike us with plague or sword.' The king of Egypt said to them, 'Moses and Aaron, why are you causing the people to neglect their work? Get to your work.' Pharaoh also said, 'Look, the people of the land are so numerous, and you would stop them from working.' That day, Pharaoh commanded the overseers of the people as well as their foremen, 'Don't continue to supply the people with straw for making bricks as before. They must go and gather straw for themselves, but require the same quota of bricks from them as they were making before. Do not reduce it, for they are slackers. That is why they are crying out, "Let us go and sacrifice to our God." Impose heavier work on the men. Then they will be occupied with it and not pay attention to deceptive words.' So the overseers and foremen of the people went out and said to them, 'This is what Pharaoh says. I am not giving you straw. Go get straw yourselves wherever you can find it, but there will be no reduction at all in your workload.' So the people scattered throughout the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw. The overseers insisted, 'Finish your assigned work each day, just as you did when straw was provided.' Then the Israelite foremen, whom Pharaoh's slave drivers had set over the people, were beaten and asked, 'Why haven't you finished making your prescribed number of bricks yesterday or today as you did before?' So the Israelite foreman went in and cried for help to Pharaoh. 'Why are you treating your servants this way? No straw has been given to your servants, yet they say to us, "Make bricks." Look, your servants are being beaten, but it is your own people who are at fault.' But he said, you are slackers, slackers. That is why you are saying, let us go sacrifice to Yahweh. Now get to work. No straw will be given to you, but you must produce the same quantity of bricks. The Israelite foremen saw that they were in trouble when they were told, you cannot reduce your daily quota of bricks. When they left Pharaoh, watch this, they confronted Moses and Aaron, who stood waiting to meet them. May the Lord take note of you and judge, they said to them, because you have made us reek in front of Pharaoh and his officials, putting a sword in their hand to kill us. So Moses went back to Yahweh and asked, Lord, why have you caused trouble for this people? And why did you ever send me? Ever since I went into Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has caused trouble for this people, and you haven't delivered your people at all. Mm. So, we see, we know the beginning of the story, the burning bush, and where God sends Moses. We're in the middle of the story. We know the end of the story, where Pharaoh's army is drowned in the sea after the people cross on dry land in the midst of the sea, right? We know the beginning and we know the end of the story, but put yourself into the shoes of these folks here, including Moses and Aaron and these Israelite foremen and the Israelites. And it doesn't look so good, right? And so I think all of us can hear ourselves asking this question that Moses asks. Why did you ever send me? Ever since we went into Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has caused trouble for this people, and you haven't delivered your people at all. Now, Moses had a certain expectation. You can hear it echoing in his question or his statement. You haven't delivered your people at all. What does that tell us about what Moses' expectation was? It tells us that Moses was expecting that what was going to happen was he was going to walk in the authority of Yahweh and tell Pharaoh how it is and what needs to happen, and Pharaoh's just going to do it. And it doesn't go that way. In fact, it goes pretty badly and very negatively. And so he's complaining from Moses' perspective, God is not delivering his people. But if we look at the very next verse, in chapter 6, verse 1, but Yahweh replied to Moses. This is Yahweh's perspective. Now you are going to see what I will do to Pharaoh. He will let them go because of my strong hand. He will drive them out of his land because of my strong hand. He won't just give permission. God says, Pharaoh's actually going to make them leave. Right? And so you've got Moses' perspective and you've got God's perspective. And, again, Moses, I think, is like most of us. We sense we have some sort of direction from the Lord, and we start going in that direction, and things go badly, and we think, did I miss it? Did I not understand the Lord? Lord, why are you doing this? Why have you not answered my prayer? Why am I suffering all this trouble? Why have you not delivered your people? All these kind of things. You said you were going to do this, and that hasn't happened. All this stuff, right? That Moses, because he had a burning bush, for crying out loud. I know I've never had a burning bush, right? So it wasn't like he didn't know God did this. He did. And yet he still has that same perspective. He has that perspective of his own perspective and his own expectations, instead of setting aside his own expectations, his own perspective, and just seeing what God's perspective is, right? God's got a plan, and he's working his plan, but he's going to do it in a particular way. And if Pharaoh had let them go out in the desert and be out there for several days and then come back, well, not much has been accomplished. If Pharaoh had just said, okay, yeah, you guys can leave, and they'd left, okay, they would have left. But when we see the way God was doing it, we see several things. One, God ends up being able to, one, get Pharaoh to make them leave instead of just giving permission. So it wasn't that, oh, Pharaoh could say, oh yeah, I did that. No. He's like, okay, this God is too powerful. These guys got to get out of here. He's recognizing God's power, right? Two, it was done in such a spectacular way that all of the countries around them were aware of what happened. They were all afraid of the Israelites, right? So you still had people like the Amalekites coming in and bothering them, and eventually the Moabites, but they were really concerned about these people, all because of what God had done. God also was able to use the situation to portray what he was going to do for all of mankind. And finally, God didn't just have Pharaoh and the people of Egypt send them away. They actually gave them the treasure of Egypt. They sent them away loaded, ready to go into the promised land, and with goods, gold, all that kind of stuff, jewelry. And so God had a much bigger idea, much bigger plan in mind than Moses was even aware of. So this is the kind of thing that we, in our own lives, we want to avoid having our own perspective, our own expectations. We want to dig in with God. What is God doing? What is his perspective? What are his expectations, right? And align ourselves with him. So if we look at the record of Joseph, we see a much better perspective, right? Now, Joseph doesn't like what's happening to him, right? But he maintains God is at work, right? He's not, he's still trusting in God. Even though his brothers have sold him into slavery, he's still trusting God. He still believes, he still trusts, he's still moving forward with God. He knows God has a plan, and he trusts it. Now, it's taking a long time, and he doesn't like the fact that it's taking a long time. And if you recall, when he's in the jail, when he's in prison, and he has it's the first time you see this in that record. He says to the baker and to the butler, the cupbearer, that he says to the cupbearer who was going to live, when you go back to Pharaoh, remember me. I'm in here falsely, and of course the cupbearer forgets about him, right? But so it wasn't that he, it's not that God necessarily expects us to enjoy persecution or something like that. But morning, Christina. It's not necessarily that he expects us to enjoy persecution, but you can see throughout this time period of Joseph, when he's like that, he has God's perspective, even though he's going through these difficult things. Now, he knows what the promise was. He was actually going to rule over his father, mother, and his brothers, right? And that is the plan. God gave him that, and that happens. So he knows that. He doesn't know how it's going to happen, but throughout, he maintains his faith, his perspective of faith. However God's going to work this out, I'm going to maintain my perspective of faith in God. And what you don't see Joseph doing that Moses does here is saying stuff like, let me go back to chapter 5 here at the end of chapter 5. Why did you ever send me? You haven't delivered your people at all. You don't see that from Joseph. What you see is, that's why Joseph is a really good type for Christ. That you see, he's got God's perspective. He's maintaining faith, even though he doesn't have the full picture. And he's just in the moment. He's living for God where he is in the moment, even though the circumstances are difficult. You can see that same thing, and we won't go into it, with David before he becomes, before the people accept him as king. He had already been anointed as king. But before the people accept him as king, when Saul is still alive and he's being persecuted by Saul, you see it when he won't even kill Saul. He's like, no, this is God's anointed. I'm not going to do that. even though he has the ability to kill Saul or take him into custody. He could do that stuff. God, was with him. He was delivered into his hand, and yet he chose no. I'm going to do this God's way. I'm not going to do it my own way. God will get the glory. And in fact, David doesn't ever have to kill Saul. Saul brings that down on his own head. So, some things to think about, and to just have, try to have our own perspective, or having our own perspective tends to lead us to wrong conclusions about what God is doing. And if we turn in faith and trust him, he's got a bigger plan. We may not recognize it right now. I mean, you think about with Stephen gets stoned to death, right? That's a pretty bad thing to happen to a person, right? And certainly none of us have ever had something so terrible happen to us. And he's there, and he's preaching the gospel to the lost, right? He's calling them to repentance, and he's standing for Christ, and they stone him to death. But in the record in Acts, what the book of Acts tells you, gives you some insight from God, because their standing with them is approving of the stoning is Saul, who would become Paul. And there's just something in that record that's going on spiritually. I can't give you this, word for word, but there's something to that. The fact that Stephen sacrifices himself. He didn't have to stand up and say all that stuff. He didn't have to take that stand. He could have just walked away. He was just in an argument with some Jews, right? He could have just walked away, but he didn't. He took a stand, and he spoke the truth, and he sacrificed himself for the kingdom. And you see Saul there, who Jesus later grabs and just pulls him in. I mean, how many people do you know that are just anti-Christ, right? They're just anti-Christians. They don't like Christians. They don't like Christianity. Don't want anything to have to do with Christianity, all that kind of stuff. How many of them would you look at and just expect, oh, this person is going to be a great Christian. They're going to be a tremendous Christian, right? And yet there's Saul. God had a bigger perspective in mind. He saw what he could do with that young man. And so, Stephen is a witness to Saul of the commitment that Paul was going to need to make to Christ, and what he was going to suffer and go through. So, you know what? And Stephen, he died in that situation, but he's going to be raised from the dead. He's going to live forever. That's God's perspective, right? Our perspective is, oh, what a tragedy. God's perspective is, I'm just going to raise him from the dead. He doesn't even know he's dead. And he'll be raised from the dead, and he'll live with me forever. So what's so bad? So, thoughts, questions?
I have lots of thoughts.
Share them with us.
So, I think this really ties in with what it means to be a child of the Most High. And I think Romans says, that his children walk in spirit and in truth. So we hold on to his word, but yet we're constantly in tune with his spirit and having discernment of what to say. Oh, is that better? Is that better?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
Sorry. I think this really ties in with Romans, what it means to be a child of the Most High and walking in spirit and in truth. And that's what he says his children will do. And so having that perspective and knowing what he's doing is us walking by his spirit. So Joseph, it's almost like being, I liken it to being a stagehand, because I feel like you know what's going on in the natural, and then what's going on, like you know what's going on stage, and then you know what's going on behind the scenes, backstage, like with having to put the props out or having to pull the props off the stage during a show. And so that's what it seems like to me, walking in spirit and in truth, because you know what's going on in the natural and what you see with your natural eyes, but then you also have the Father's perspective by his Spirit, by his Ruach HaKodesh, in knowing what he's doing behind the scenes. And it's having that sight to see in the Spirit that gives us our faith to walk out the things in the natural when what we see with our natural eyes doesn't always look right. So, I mean, that's one thing, one thought. And then I you know, there's just been several things that have happened this week in my own life. I can share those, or I can wait for another time. It doesn't matter.
You can share 'em.
Well,
We are recording, so I don't know if that matters or not to you.
no, that's fine. Let's see. I had mentioned I think this past Wednesday, needing prayer for a place where the Father had sent me. And so I went again yesterday, and they always take food because they have brunch afterwards. And so I took my food, and the pastor and one of his elders are in the parking lot. And just some backstory, this is my third time going there. And recently, now I had been going there 2 years ago, and the Father pulled me out because he said I was picking up their tradition. And I said, oh, okay. But now he sent me back in, and the first Sabbath he gave me a word. The second Sabbath he gave me a word, and it was on unity, bitterness, and unforgiveness, both times. And so I go back this third time, and as soon as I pull into the parking lot, the pastor goes inside, and I'm getting all my stuff out of the car, and I'm walking across the parking lot, and he comes back out, and he said, we voted, the elders unanimously have voted that you are not welcome here, so leave. And I said, that's interesting. Okay, I have a lot of mushrooms. Would you like to transfer them into another container so you can keep them? And he basically just said, no, we have everything we need here. And initially I had gone to hug him before he started talking, and he just went like this. And I said, okay. So I lifted my little right foot up and kicked my heel, and lifted my left foot up and kicked my heel. And I hugged the elder, and he gave me a hug, and I just said, thank you, you know, and got in my car and went on my way. But, you know, that's like a moment with Moses. It's like, okay, why did you send me? Like, why did you send me back? You had me deliver 2 words, and only the pastors were the ones to see them. Like, they wouldn't let them go forward. And so, you know, and like I had said last time, when they sat me in front of their board of 6 people, and they were verbally abusive, false accusations, it was a huge shocker. But the Father, what he was showing me, if I looked at it with my flesh, you could have been easily offended. But looking at it with my spirit, he was showing me their sin, their hurt, and their pain, and knowing how to pray for them. So maybe that's all he wanted me to see. Just those 2 words, wanted to show me that. And so even though I'm not allowed to be there, I still know how to pray for them. And so I think that's, you know, I think it's really cool. I know most people might, you know, walk out of there like, oh my gosh, that was so rude, that was so messed up, and all these things, but it's okay. He's working on us, and he's working on all of us. And he's teaching us how to love one another as he commanded us to love each other. So, yeah, so that's one example.
That's a good example. Yeah, because it can be, tough in those situations where you're now separated from the situation and you can't really see what else God is doing. For example, on one end of the spectrum, you might not see that he is bringing judgment against that church, and he needed this to happen in order for him to righteously bring judgment against those people and dismantle their church, right? Or it might be the other end of it might be a Nineveh, right? And but you're just the precursor to Jonah, right? There's another person who's going to come in later.
She's John the Baptist and Jesus
and give the same message. And suddenly, and maybe even some of the elders and whatnot are like, oh, this is happening again. And someone says, maybe we should listen this time, because maybe this is God trying to tell us something, right? And suddenly they all kind of take a step back and they're, maybe. But you don't get to see that, right? So it makes it tough. When, Moses, he got to see the whole kit and caboodle. And so, he got to see when they got delivered out of Egypt. But so often we're in the midst of what God is doing and we don't see that. Mm-hmm. And so we just have to trust that, he's working. When he gives us something to do, we just obey and trust him. We may not get the whole perspective, but you're right. What we don't want to do in those situations is have our own perspective
and take it personally and get offended.
Yeah, get offended, and that kind of thing, and that sort of stuff. This past year, obviously we separated from ministry we were a part of, and I don't know if I'll get to see the end result of what was going on or not, but and it was very tough in the midst of that. But I also knew what God's perspective was. He had shown me what his perspective was. And so I just decided, okay, I'm gonna adopt his perspective on this stuff. And it was so much easier to go through what was happening because he had shown me his perspective. And I decided, okay, that's what you're doing. That's I'm gonna trust you, and I'm not gonna be offended. I'm not gonna worry about it, and I look forward to what you have for me to do next. So, anybody else? Yeah, Christina.
So I wish I had gotten on a little earlier so I could have heard everything. So I look forward to hearing it all, John. And it just reminded me last week we were sharing testimonies, and, talking about testimonies and all. And I don't know if that related to your teaching this week or not, but it reminded me about that and how I've been thinking, and it sounded to me like it related to your teaching, was how God can show us to do things, but it doesn't always go the way we would hope things would go. And is that is what is that right? That's kind of how we don't see the big perspective, like we don't see right. God's perspective. Yeah. So even though
with Moses about how God told Moses to go to Pharaoh and ask him to let people go, and the people go, and things got worse for them.
Yes.
And Moses was pretty upset about it. And he said, God,
why did you even send me?
Why did you even send me this? This is just worse.
Yeah, and he had to keep going back. And it just shows how even if things get worse, and even if things make absolutely no sense, that doesn't mean that God didn't tell us to do what he told us to do. And that doesn't mean that we should get discouraged and, give up and lose hope or question our relationship with him. Question, did he really tell me to do that? Like, it's not going the way I hoped it would go, or the way I thought it would go, or like, why? Because it's like, so often testimonies always go really, really positive. And not that, even with what Melissa was sharing, you know, it could go in a beautiful way. Like, we don't know what's going to happen to, like, this afternoon with some of those people that you went and spoke to, and, or, you know, what's going to happen tomorrow. Like, even if they don't want to process, like, everything that God told you to tell them now, they could process it tomorrow afternoon. It could just hit them and be like, oh my gosh. And it could be like the light shined in, and we don't know. Sometimes we're kind of slow. And so, yeah, so I really appreciated hearing the little bit that I heard, John, and also from you, Melissa. It's very encouraging to me, and just like, not, you know, not to, like, you don't give up even when things aren't going as you think should go planned, because we don't have God's, like, what we should do, like you were saying, is adopt God's perspective. And I know in my life there's been times, just like with Melissa, where then God has shown me, like, the hurt that someone is going through, and to then see really how to pray for that person or that group of people. I could really relate to that, Melissa. And whereas then maybe if we hadn't done what he told us to do, then we wouldn't have maybe seen that. And so I think that stood out to me. I'm sorry I came in late again.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't.
But I want to listen to the rest of it.
Yeah,
and
I got it recorded, so it'll be posted.
By the way,
Yeah.
you opened your scarf. Thank you so much for
Oh.
sending that to me. It's beautiful.
Oh, good. Well, thank you for having us over. It was a
I'm
great time. And
looking forward to having my own. Also, I borrowed my daughter's. I don't have one like that, and
cool.
I borrowed my daughter's the other day. I was like, now I have my own actual hand crocheted scarf.
I'm glad you liked
All
it.
I have beside that is I have this one. It's just like a fleece thing. You know, it's just one of those inexpensive fleece scarves, and I wanted to wear, you know, something one day that was it was a little nicer scarf than that. So this one's even nicer. The one you sent me is even nicer than the one that I borrowed from her. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well,
And
why don't we? I'm gonna stop the recording, and then we can pray. But before I do, I just want to, for anybody who's watching this video later, we've started a second Sunday morning fellowship that is intended to be better for people who are either get up late on Sunday mornings, or who are on, you know, Mountain or West Coast time, because obviously the 8:30 Central time for the first fellowship is pretty early if you're on the West Coast. And so this is 11 o'clock Central time, and it uses the same Zoom code as the first meeting. And if you haven't checked us out already, you can find us on Facebook at Christian Virtual Fellowship, or on YouTube at Christian Virtual Fellowship. And we also have the group Allegiance to the King on Facebook as well. So we'd love to have you join us.